Okay. Yeah. Oh my God. Okay. Um, Hi guys. So thank you so much for joining. Today we have the Environmental Sustainability Cardinal Corner panel, and we have our three panelists today, Alinka, Lindsay, and Megan. So maybe going in that order, we're just wondering, can you tell us about yourself and the Cardinal Quarter that you completed, along with a brief summary of the work that you did?
Yeah, so me first.
Mhm.
Okay, incredible. I'm Alinka. I am a junior, currently an Earth Systems major, Land Systems concentration. And my Cardinal Quarter was technically through the Bill Lane Center. I worked at the Henry's Fork Foundation in Ashton, Idaho. And so it was technically counted as a Cardinal Quarter, but not necessarily. I didn't really work a lot with Cardinal Quarter supervisors, but it still counted. And so a lot of my work was, so I was a freshman when I did my internship, so they wanted to help me gain a lot of skills. So I like a lot of mixture of things. I did field work, I did office work, I also did research that suited my interests and also my skills. So I did an economic analysis of second home in the eastern Idaho region and looking at economic impact. I also worked with the National Forest Service, and we conducted a water trail usage survey, in which involved interviewing patrons of the area who used the recreational trails or the rivers. And so it was just like a mixture of skills generally, and it was a really good time.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm also a junior, and I'm studying environmental engineering and international relations. I did a Cardinal Quarter after my freshman year during the summer, and I worked at the California State Water Resources Control Board in Sacramento. I worked in the Office of Information Management and Analysis, and I did two main projects. One was related to harmful algal blooms. So I researched kind of what's being done internationally to monitor and mitigate these really toxic algal blooms. And I created like a public facing data portal to put on the website. And I also wrote a white paper kind of recommending improvements to California's program. And then I also did a secondary project with like water utility district mapping across the state, just contacting individual utilities and using ArcGIS to make shape files and stuff. So yeah, that was it.
Yeah, so I'm Megan. I'm a senior studying Earth Systems with a concentration in sustainable food and agriculture, and I'm a co-term in sustainability science and practice. And I spent the summer of 2019 working as a regenerative ranching intern at the Tomcat Ranch in Pescadero. And I basically spent the summer learning holistic land management and low stress stockmanship and adaptive grazing, which all fall under regenerative agriculture. And just spent the summer getting to know the regenerative sustainable agriculture community in that area of California, and learning these foundational concepts of regenerative agriculture.
Thank you, guys. So going on to elaborating about your Cardinal Quarter experiences, we were wondering if you could share one or two highlights from your summer. This can be technical or like a personal milestone you reached.
Yeah. I really, really love field research. That's why, honestly, I became an Earth Systems major in the first place, specifically a land systems major. And so any opportunity that I had to just go out in the field and spend a day out on the river or out in the fields doing different types of sampling. Sometimes we do water sampling, sometimes we do vegetation sampling, depending on the projects that we were helping. It was just so nice to like get outside and have the outdoors be your office for the day. And besides work, what is really cool about working for the Henry Ford Foundation is that you kind of have like a little community, because I was living with other interns from different universities that were also helping at the nonprofit. And so for a weekend, actually, our supervisors took us more into central Idaho to Bora Peak, which is the highest mountain in Idaho. And we camped, and then at 4 a.m. we we ascended Bora, and took us the whole day. It was like a class 3, class 4 scramble at the very top. It was terrifying. um but it was really awesome. So just like having like that give and take of having experiences outside in a more personal but also in like a more like professional setting was a really good experience.
I'd say one of my favorite parts of the summer, the secondary project I mentioned with the water utility districts, wasn't my original assignment, but I kind of picked it up to help out. She wasn't my boss, but she kind of taught me about it, and I ended up doing a lot of work for her, and she was very appreciative. And so towards the end of the summer, she took me out for lunch to thank me, and it yeah, she was pretty cool. So that was a fun part of the summer.
I think probably the highlight for me was just being on the ranch every day and working a lot, like working from like 7 a.m. to like 5 p.m. Outside all day. And it didn't really feel like work. Like I felt really tired, but it didn't feel like work. And it's a beautiful area in Pescadero, and I got to work with the same basically herd of cows for most of the summer, and they kind of became my responsibility. And it was just really fun to see how attached we both became to each other. And it was also really a trial and error process, like caring for them. And it was really rewarding when I felt like I could do a good job for them. Whereas in the beginning, I was constantly making mistakes, some mistakes that I won't admit on camera, but it was just a really rewarding highlight.
Thank you guys so much. In the same vein, I know some of you talked about maybe things you didn't expect, but what was like a positive experience or aspect of your summer that you didn't initially expect? I know, Alinka, you kind of talked about it with like this hike, but maybe other realms and other instances?
Yeah, I think it was kind of interesting because I think like for a lot of like generally whenever an employer like finds Stanford student, like there's kind of like the prototype Stanford student. And even though like we interviewed and we talked about my skills and stuff, I like for like there's an expectation, like there was a joke at my workspace that the person from Stanford is this guy named Zach, and he majors in CS, and that he can help with like the specific project, but I am not that person. So it was like it was I'm getting the positive part. So it was like they kind of had like projects for me, but then it was up to me. Like I kind of like take that onus of creating stuff that kind of fit my skill set. So I think for me it was like really it was really cool to have kind of like the ability to craft like my own project, which I didn't really expect, because usually at least for like the Lane Center projects, like you kind of like are given something to like help or just like generally like carry the project along. But it was cool to like kind of have that initiative and be able to say like after I was done, like I was able to find something for me. And that's also something that's really helpful, at least for like future job like interviews and job searches, because they usually look for people who are independent and can create like projects for themselves or like be more self-led. So that's something I was definitely not expecting.
Something I was not expecting actually happened after my Cardinal Quarter. So before I went to Sacramento, I had to meet with like a faculty mentor at Stanford, and she kind of briefed me on what to expect and gave me some resources about California water and stuff. And then afterwards, like in September, I met with her again to kind of debrief what happened over the summer, and I showed her a lot of the work I had done, and she was impressed. And so she asked me to do some research with her, and I'm actually still working with her through this year. So that was kind of a cool opportunity that I guess came out of the Cardinal Quarter.
I would say one of the big things I really didn't expect to get out of my experience in particular was this really kind of new framework of making decisions and thinking about the future that I got from basically holistic land management. We would talk all the time about two concepts that have really resonated with me. And the first one is context, which is more than just like where you and the things that you're trying to accomplish occur, but it's like all of your resources and your goals and your values and how they all come together to basically create a solution set for whatever you're trying to achieve, whether that's in how you're going to manage your land or if that's in like how you're going to view decisions for your career. And then we also talked all the time about managing for what you want and not what you don't want, because sometimes when you're managing for what you don't want, you end up limiting your opportunities. And we learned all this in the context of like, how do you manage the feed that you maintain on your land? How do you manage basically your grass? But it has all these relevant applications to making decisions, especially as a young person trying to make decisions about my career and what I want my future to look like. So beginning to think about my context kind of as this set of things that I can choose. Like I can choose what values are important to me, and I can choose what quality of life is important to me. And then I can use that to make decisions instead of just thinking about what we were used to thinking about, like salary or expectation. And then thinking about managing for what I want in coordination with the context is really valuable framework for me about trying to put aside some of the concerns that deter me from making certain decisions and start focusing on trying to achieve what it is that I want, if that makes sense. But yeah, that was totally unexpected kind of revelation.
Yeah, that sounds so great. And like honestly, something I think we're all I'm at least struggling with. So that's really great to hear, Megan. We actually have a question from the audience, which is crazy. Thank you. So we have someone wondering, with these diverse set of experiences you have that are like very official, either in the government, in data analysis, and regenerative ranching broadly, how much experience, whether it be classes or through either internships, is needed when you enter these places? Does it depend on your internship? What advice can you guys offer here?
Yeah, I find myself telling this a lot to underclassmen, especially freshmen, because I applied to the Bill Lane Center internship opportunities as a freshman. And I definitely, even now, for some reason, like I still hesitate and kind of like doubt myself because I feel like I haven't taken as many like skill set or like industry minded classes as a lot of other people may have, or maybe have experience with. And at least in the case of the Bill Lane Center, and this is probably true for Cardinal Quarter opportunities as well, especially ones that you were able to design like for yourself, don't let that stop you. Mostly because like with these opportunities, you will have supervisors who are willing to teach you skills if you don't already have them, as long as you're willing to learn. That's mainly what people are looking for, and like being flexible, being willing to learn, and like maybe having a little like background knowledge, especially with like sustainability type concepts or like environmental environmental focused jobs. But truly, like especially the people will understand, like if you are a freshman and you are applying, like obviously like you won't have taken that many classes, especially by now. So don't let that stop you, but also like don't undersell what you have, because I think a lot of people kind of maybe overlook skills that they already have and like write it off as not important because other people have like stronger concentrations in different things. But that's kind of like the beauty of it all. So like don't undersell yourself and just kind of like put yourself out there. Like don't be afraid.
I totally agree. I would say definitely don't exclude things, even if you don't feel like you're entirely prepared for them or even interested. Like, I applied through the Stanford and government Cardinal Quarter ones to just a bunch of sustainability, like environment ones, but I didn't actually apply to the one I ended up doing. I just went to an interview for something related to energy or air pollution, which is what I knew more about. And then they followed up and said, you know, we think you might be good at the water board. And I was like, okay, I didn't really know anything about water, but I just went with it, and I talked to that mentor at Stanford beforehand, a professor at Stanford, and she helped give me some resources to kind of read up on. And then before I got there, I just emailed my supervisor, and she told me like what computer programs I'd be using, and so I just downloaded those and started poking around because I hadn't used them. But I wouldn't shy away from things because you think you're not qualified.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think my philosophy approaching internships has always been that they're internships for a reason. They're not like full-time jobs because they really are geared towards educating. Um, they're they're not expect no one is really, I don't think, expecting you to come in with all the skills. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a very valuable internship for you. And I think that the most important thing is to be passionate about what you want to do. You know, you might not have all the skills. Like when I was working at the ranch, I'd never ranched before in my life. Never been I'd never been in like any serious agricultural context. Um, and it was just something that I was passionate about and was really excited about and dedicated to learn about. And I think that if you can communicate that you will be committed to the entire process because you're passionate and interested, that you'll have plenty of opportunities, and it's not going to be limited by your prior experience.
These are great words. And like, honestly, I think this applies to internships broadly, even outside the Haas Center and like opportunities at Stanford. Yeah, I think generally there's like some fact that like a lot of males tend to get more jobs just because they apply even though they're not really qualified rather than women. That's just an independent aside, but I think, you know, putting yourself out there and applying is always great. I'm not a panelist though, so don't listen to me too much. So another question, we just talked about, you know, how you can prepare, or like, I guess the mindset you should go in when you're preparing for these things and applying. But simultaneously, I would love to hear about, you know, your experiences with the interview process, with finding an internship in the first place. I know Lindsay touched upon the fact that, you know, she wasn't expecting it or that particular opportunity, but, you know, what tangible things can you do to prepare? What gravitated you towards your particular internship? And, you know, how do you even go about finding one in this, especially if it's self-designed?
Right. Mine wasn't self-designed. I honestly just like found the Bill Lane Center program and was just like, okay, I'm applying to as many things as I can, which is 2. For the Bill Lane Center, you can only apply for up to 2 internships. And then after the first rounds, actually what happened in my case was like I applied to my top 2. I didn't get my top 2, and then second rounds came again. And then the person who applied to the Henry Ford Foundation actually dropped. So I reapplied, so I technically like applied to 3, but it's in like extenuating circumstances. So mine was also kind of like a happy accident in a way. But before my interview, I definitely like immediately looked up the website. I looked up what the projects they were doing, so I would be knowledgeable about like what they were planning to do for like the coming year, or if not like the coming couple of years. I sometimes like I look up like who my possible supervisors could be and like what their interests are, so like I can like ask them questions about it. I was able to connect with my interviewer about ski racing because he really likes to ski and I ski sometimes whenever I have the time in the winter. So that was cool. So just like sometimes just like looking up who is going to be interviewing you is always really helpful. And then after the fact, for kind of like gearing towards projects before you show up, it's always great to just like ask questions for your supervisors. Like it's just always better to come prepared, especially like depending on where you are. I was in a more remote place, so it was good to have everything that I needed with me by the time I got there. and then like with like clothing, gear and stuff. And then also like sometimes jobs will require you to be physically fit, and that's also another thing that you should ask your supervisor, like what are the, my circumstances, how do I need to be prepared. But usually like the person who is in charge, if depending on your job, should be able to communicate that to you without you having to ask questions, but it's always different for different opportunities, of course.
Similarly, for the ones I did interview for, I did kind of a Google search and looked around the websites and tried to do a bit of reading, just to know what the organization was working on. And then another thing I think is important is just in the interviews being honest about like, I was like honest about not having a ton of experience with certain things, but also like showed that I was enthusiastic about it. And I think that goes a long way. And yeah, like you said, just a lot of preparation, talking to your supervisor beforehand, asking questions. It's all good.
Yeah, I think one of the key things about getting ready for an interview is to think about your answers for questions about yourself, because it's hard sometimes on the spot when they're like, well, why? It's a basic question like, why do you want to do this? And you spend all this time thinking about it, and now so all of a sudden nothing comes to mind. Because I mean, there's lots of value in preparing and knowing who you're going to talk to, but I think that you can never go wrong if you have a clear idea of your motivations and what you want to get out of it, and you're genuine about your feelings and your experience. The interviewers don't want to hear like what they want to hear. They want to hear what you have to say, and that can be hard. I think when it's your first time having a serious interview to feel comfortable being honest about things that might be perceived as weaknesses. But I know from talking to the people who hired me at the ranch, in some of those things that felt like weaknesses, like having limited experience, actually made me seem like a good candidate, someone that they could actually teach, and they wouldn't be erasing knowledge that this person already had. You're an open book for them to help educate this, in this case, kind of new concept of regenerative agriculture. And so sometimes it's just the best service you can do to yourself is just be as honest as possible. And that's really the only good advice that I can give.
Can I add to that? Yeah, I feel like whenever I'm doing interviews, like it's like this really weird like pressure to be professional, and sometimes like depending on who you are, that's just like not it. Obviously like it's like a case by case basis, but I actually brought this up in an interview I did recently. I was like, I don't feel comfortable like acting professional because it's like not who I am. Like I'm gonna be like honest, and I'm gonna tell people like, and I'm gonna act like accordingly. Like I'm not gonna act out. But yeah, I like totally resonated with that.
Amazing. Yeah. This is some real stuff. We're coming in on like the final two questions, but one of them I wanted to ask, was, and I think Lindsay touched upon this, like she's doing research with the person who she worked with over the summer, but how has completing your Cardinal Quarter either changed the way you think about yourself, which, we've talked about a little bit, but like being more assertive and being more confident, but also your future, whether it be professionally or not, or vocationally, and the world broadly?
I think my experience, like kind of the purpose of me doing it was trying to see, okay, is this like what I really want to do? Like, do I want to be doing field work? Do I want to be doing sustainable or like conservation type work? And so for me, it was just incredibly validating to be doing a job that I felt good doing every day. And also, like, coupled with that, working with different people in that field to give me like different perspectives on how they have interpreted their job and like how their job has influenced them was really really awesome. And to like have like a group of different supervisors to be able to like ask a bunch of different questions, it was super super helpful. But yeah, for me, it was just like incredibly validating, but then also I had like a lot of like time to myself, even though I was living with people in the housing. And so like, I don't know, it gave me just like a lot of time to think about um I'm trying to think of the word, like positionality as somebody in like a conservation job, and trying, yeah, and just like, I was able to like ask a lot of questions and to kind of like figure that out and work through it. So both like it was both validating, but also has like I'm still constantly thinking about it, how like I can move forward with this job in like a responsible way.
Something for me that I realized, I spent a lot of time in an office that summer, working at a desk. And even though I was really genuinely interested in what I was doing, it was still pretty hard at times. I would get antsy. And so I think that's something I took away from it, that I'd like to be doing something a bit more active, or with people more in the future. And when I've been looking at what to do with my summers since then, I've definitely kept that in mind.
I think one of the big things that I kind of took away from this experience, because it was something that was so different from what I had ever done before, and it was so successful, like I really enjoyed it. It really helped me kind of get over this barrier of like, I need to do things that I have some precedent for doing. Like I've done it before, or I have some education that qualifies me for it. So it's really helped me think more about just taking the chances and doing things that I think are interesting. But in kind of a broader sense, I have kind of developed my knowledge a lot in terms of agriculture and regenerative agriculture, and what lifestyle that could lead to for me in the future, because it is kind of a challenge. I'm really compelled to do work in regenerative agriculture, but there's also this kind of tension between doing this work that I love and then having to kind of sacrifice some things that I like. Like I do like the benefits of being in urban areas and I like being able to like go to concerts when I want to. And I would like being able to meet lots of friends, if that's what I want to do. But it's a little more difficult if you have a lifestyle that you're working most of the day and you're in a rural area. And so it's this opportunity has helped me think a lot more about how to kind of plan and balance what I want in the future. It hasn't necessarily produced all the answers and just a lot of questions. But it's also given me kind of a little bit more motivation in terms of I do want to do a job that has a positive impact, particularly in terms of agriculture, because I could see all of the reward of that over the summer. And so I guess the only certainty that I really derived is that that's not really something that I want to give up. But yeah, it really just created a lot of questions.
Thank you, guys. And so for our last question for the panel, we'll be ending a little early, is what is one piece of advice that you'd want? I know there's a lot of advice that happened, a lot of good stuff, but like another one is, what is one piece of advice that you would give to students currently who are evaluating different spring and summer opportunities through Cardinal Quarter?
Me unmutes myself, still trying to formulate a thought. Yeah, I think I think like just throughout the process, like we obviously touched on this earlier, but don't doubt yourself. And this can even continue even after you've gotten the job. This internship was the first time I like genuinely had to like, like live on my own. Like obviously, like if you like maybe like dorm style living is a first time you can have like a taste of independence, but like truly like living in a housing unit where you have to like buy your own food, cook your own food, budget your stipend, that can be really overwhelming. But there are people who are willing to support you. I know that I was able to reach out to my supervisor both at the foundation and also back at the Bill Lane Center if I ever had like questions or anxieties or concerns. But also that's kind of like an element, it requires an element of like self-confidence that like you were able to get to where you are, and everything just kind of like works out in the end, but it's a lot easier if you are confident in yourself.
I know this has kind of already been touched on, but I think it's really important just not to dismiss opportunities because you think you aren't the perfect candidate. If you're genuinely interested in it, I think that comes across in the interviews. And also, don't be afraid to try, new things that you haven't done in the past. And that even extends to once you're on the job. If you're interested in a project that someone is doing, like you should ask them about it, even if that's not, what you're there for. Usually, people are pretty happy to talk to you and teach you, and yeah.
Yeah, in terms of like the process of thinking about what you want to do, the advice that I think would have been helpful for me is that you can ask questions. Like before you've applied, you can ask questions, and it's not weird if you do that. Because sometimes as you're writing an essay or you're trying to figure out what your summer would look like, you realize you have these questions that could be kind of significant. So definitely do that. Definitely find whoever it is that can answer your questions. If you're applying to the Haas Center, I think there are people who you can email. But sometimes I think you can email like who your summer supervisor would be directly. But like more broadly, I would say like choose things that seem like opportunities you might not get again or that seem really exciting. Like things that you're like, I can do this now because it's something crazy that I don't even know if it's what I want to do in the rest of my life, but it seems like it would be a great opportunity. And don't be intimidated by that, even if it seems like hard or competitive. I think everybody at Stanford has applied to things because they thought that they would be really cool and has not gotten them, and that's just how it works. But the hardest thing is looking back and knowing that you didn't try to do things that you would have liked. Because looking back as a senior, I know there are certain things that maybe I could have taken advantage of or at least tried, and I wouldn't have to be kicking myself now. But yeah, I think that like if the college years are for experimenting with the types of jobs and activities and things you want to do. So like do whatever it is that interests you.
Thank you so much, Alinka, Lindsay, and Megan. I'm sure everyone, freshmen, underclassmen, and upperclassmen will really benefit from this. There was one just final question about remote work and, whether or not I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on this too, but someone was wondering, will the internships be remote or in person? And I do want to stress that, like, of course, these times are really hard. I did an internship that was remote this past summer. I don't know about everyone else, and, please comment on it too, even if it's outside of the Haas Center. But I really think you can make as much of an impact in person as you can remote. And I know that sounds hard and it requires like more accountability in some ways, but you can make a lot of partnerships and also have things for the long term. So like I was working with a nonprofit and gave them a bunch of like animated short videos that they've been using as educational content. And they were like, if you want to come back next year and come back, we'd love to have you in person. So I don't think like the in-person or remote thing is necessarily a negative factor. If anyone else wants to comment on that, please jump in. If not, that's cool too.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question, especially for like people like me who are interested in fieldwork, because you need experience in fieldwork to be able to like progress in that field, and not being in person is extremely difficult to do that. So I think I mentioned this in the chat, but I think depending on the Bill Lane experience, it is possible that based off of how different distancing protocols work and on location, it varies for in-person to remote, but also I I would also have to echo Kelly's comment on in terms of like efficacy from doing remote work. Also, I think it is important to consider like public health impact for entering rural areas, specifically during a pandemic. But obviously that would be a supervisor responsibility as well. So having communication with orgs that are offering remote work, but also like are maybe considering just like being in constant contact and like trying to have transparency about that, I think is really important. But yeah, I from like the Billings Center standpoint, there are options, but I think that is also subject to whatever the future has.
This isn't necessarily sustainability related, but I think there are some unique internship opportunities right now because of COVID. Like, for example, right now I'm doing an internship on like a COVID-19 workers' rights helpline. And so there are some, and you know, they have a really good virtual platform that they've set up. And so you might look for things that have come about this year that are maybe related to COVID or something like that.
I'll just jump in quick to add that the decision to be in person or remote rests with the university. So many steps above where my decision-making skills are. And we've seen how decisions have been made at the university. So just keep some of those things in mind, but we don't control it as much as the university does.
In other words, if you have qualms, you can hit up Mark, Tessia, Levine, or Cece Buback or Cole. Anyways, this is the end of our panel, and I just want to say thank you again, Megan, Lindsay, and Linka. I'm sure everyone will really benefit from this, and you can find this, if you're watching this, you might be on the YouTube channel, it'll be there. Thank you so much, guys. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Incredible, so good.
Job for